For my third quarter book report project, I will be discussing the central theme, good versus evil, in the book The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The story starts off with Mr. Utterson talking to Mr. Enfield when they suddenly see the street corner where a young girl was trampled by a man named Mr. Hyde. After the incident, Mr. Hyde gave the family large sums of money, but the checks were in Dr. Jekyll's name. It is later learned that Dr. Jekyll has entrusted his will in Mr. Utterson, his lawyer and trusted friend. Mr. Utterson does what is requested of him for the will, but is quite concerned because Dr. Jekyll has listed Mr. Hyde as the beneficiary of all of his money and property. This causes Mr. Utterson to have nightmares and crazy thoughts of murder. He must learn more, and luckily Dr. Jekyll has invited him to a dinner party at his house. At the dinner party, Mr. Utterson pushes Dr. Jekyll on his will and the question, why Mr. Hyde? Dr. Jekyll gives little information, and at some point gets pretty mad. At the dinner party, Mr. Utterson pushes Dr. Jekyll on his will and the question, why Mr. Hyde? Dr. Jekyll gives little information, and at some point gets pretty mad. Then, one night, a man is seen beaten to death with a cane. Mr. Utterson is set to investigate the dead body. On the dead body, there is a note to him. Then, he goes to the Hyde household, and inside is the murder weapon, Dr. Jekyll's cane. This confuses Mr. Utterson, so he goes to Dr. Jekyll's house, only to find a note from Mr. Hyde to Jekyll, but it isn't Hyde's handwriting, it's Jekyll's. Then, Lanyon, a friend of Utterson and Jekyll, gives Mr. Utterson a note, but he says don't open it until Mr. Jekyll disappears. Mr. Utterson goes back to Jekyll's house, only to find from his servant, Poole, that the doctor has locked himself in the laboratory. The servant and Mr. Utterson break into the laboratory and find Mr. Hyde. He committed suicide. This is when Mr. Utterson reads Lanyon's letter and finally puts the pieces together. All this time, Dr. Jekyll has released an alter ego named Mr. Hyde. Hyde is a free soul, destructive, and violent person. But Dr. Jekyll was happy to release him because he could control Mr. Hyde with the potion he made. Except, he began to inadvertently transform into his vicious alter ego at night. Dr. Jekyll cannot control Mr. Hyde anymore, and now he begins to transform in the daylight. He realizes that he will soon transform into Hyde and never return to Jekyll. This is the reason for the will with Mr. Utterson, and him leaving all the money to Mr. Hyde. In the story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Jekyll and Hyde represent our innermost desires we all contain as humans. Dr. Jekyll represents our wanting to be as good as possible, a loving and caring human. But Mr. Hyde represents the evil we all contain inside, and at some points in our lives is released. Except, in this case, Dr. Jekyll thought he had his alter ego under control, but in reality, Mr. Hyde was just beginning to overpower and eventually take over the body of Dr. Jekyll. This represents the duality of humans and our ever-growing struggle against good versus evil. Dr. Jekyll even stated in the book that man is not truly one, but truly two. Dr. Jekyll was taken over by his malicious counterpart, Mr. Hyde. This leads the reader to believe that first, Dr. Jekyll was not morally strong enough to stay in power, and second that Dr. Jekyll wanted to be his pure evil self subconsciously without even realizing it. The battle over good versus evil in this story is something that is never truly finished. Although Hyde eventually took over the body of the doctor, like he suspected, there was still a part of Jekyll inside Hyde. So, if he didn't kill himself, then maybe Jekyll could have overpowered Hyde and regained control. In the end, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde both perish, not as separate beings, but as two people battling over one singular body. This battle of good versus evil finished with Mr. Hyde killing himself and the doctor, but would the blood-driven Hyde really kill himself? Or did Dr. Jekyll, in a state of power, supersede Hyde and kill him because there was something that had to be done?